In the heart of Manhattan, where steel and glass pierce the sky like monuments to ambition, there once stood an empire built not on oil or railroads, but on something far more intoxicating: power itself. This is the story of the Ashford family, a name that once commanded respect in boardrooms from Wall Street to Washington, a dynasty that seemed untouchable, immortal even. But every empire, no matter how mighty, carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. And for the Ashfords, that seed was planted long before anyone realized the ground beneath them had begun to crack. The year was 1973. Richard Ashford stood at the pinnacle of American power. At 52 years old, he was the chairman of Ashford Industries, a conglomerate that had its fingers in everything from defense contracts to media empires, from real estate to telecommunications. Forbes estimated his worth at over $2 billion, an astronomical sum in those days. But Richard Ashford didn't just want money. He wanted legacy. He wanted immortality through his children, through a dynasty that would bear his name for generations to come. Richard had 3 children. The eldest, Marcus, was 30 years old, groomed since birth to inherit the throne. He had his father's sharp mind and sharper instincts, a Harvard MBA, and a reputation on Wall Street as a man who could turn lead into gold. Then there was Victoria, 27, beautiful and brilliant, who ran the family's charitable foundation with an iron fist wrapped in velvet. And finally there was Daniel, the youngest at 24, the family's black sheep, the one who asked too many questions, who challenged his father at every turn, who seemed more interested in art galleries and philosophy than balance sheets and profit margins. It was Daniel who would ultimately destroy them all, though not in the way anyone expected. Because Daniel Ashford carried a secret, a truth so explosive that when it finally detonated it would leave nothing but scorched earth where the Ashford Empire once stood. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how a family could fall so far, so fast, we must first understand how they rose. The Ashford story begins not in Manhattan's gleaming towers, but in the coal mines of Pennsylvania, 3 generations earlier, with a man named Samuel Ashford, who arrived in America with nothing but calloused hands and an unshakable belief that in this new world anything was possible. Samuel worked those mines for 15 years, saving every penny, learning to read by candlelight after 16-hour shifts. He invested in land, then in the mines themselves, then in the railroads that carried the coal. By the time he died in 1928, just before the Great Crash, he had built the foundation of what would become Ashford Industries. His son, William, Richard's father, survived the Depression by being more ruthless than his competitors, buying up failing businesses for pennies on the dollar, consolidating power while others crumbled. But it was Richard who transformed the family business into something truly formidable. In the chaos following World War II, Richard saw opportunities everywhere. He diversified, modernized, globalized. He understood that the new American empire wasn't built on coal and steel alone, but on information, on influence, on being present in every room where decisions were made. He cultivated relationships with senators and presidents, with generals and judges. The Ashford name became synonymous with American power itself. By the early 70s, Richard Ashford had achieved everything a man could want. His company was thriving, his children were successful, his wife Elizabeth was the toast of New York society. From the outside, the Ashfords were perfect, untouchable, blessed. But perfection is always an illusion, and the Ashfords were about to discover that the higher you climb, the more catastrophic the fall. The first crack appeared in the summer of 1973, though almost no one noticed it at the time. Daniel Ashford, the youngest son, had been working in the company's legal department, a position his father had created for him, more out of obligation than expectation. Daniel was supposed to be reviewing contracts, learning the business from the ground up, preparing to take his place in the family empire. Instead, he stumbled upon something that didn't make sense: a series of payments, carefully hidden in the labyrinth of corporate accounting, flowing to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Millions of dollars, with no clear purpose, no paper trail, no explanation. Daniel did what his father had always told him never to do. He asked questions, he dug deeper. And what he found was a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American government. a secret war being fought with Ashford money, a web of lies and illegal operations that implicated not just his father, but dozens of powerful men who were supposed to be serving the American people. When Daniel confronted his father, Richard Ashford didn't deny it. In his study, surrounded by first editions and portraits of Ashford ancestors, Richard explained to his youngest son how the world really worked. There were threats to American interests, he said, threats that the government couldn't address through official channels. There were opportunities that required discretion, deniability. The Ashfords, Richard explained with chilling calm, were patriots. They were doing what needed to be done, what weak men in Washington didn't have the courage to do themselves. Daniel listened to his father's justifications, his rationalizations, his appeals to duty and destiny. And then Daniel Ashford made a choice that would destroy his family. He walked out of that study, got into his car, and drove to the offices of a young, ambitious journalist named Sarah Chen, who worked for the Washington Post. Sarah Chen was 29 years old when Daniel Ashford walked into her life carrying a leather briefcase filled with documents that would change everything. She had been working at the Washington Post for 3 years, mostly covering local politics and minor corruption cases, always hoping for the story that would make her career. She never imagined it would come gift-wrapped by the son of one of America's most powerful families. It was a Tuesday evening in late August, 1973. The newsroom was nearly empty, just the skeleton crew preparing the next morning's edition. Sarah was at her desk, reviewing notes on a zoning scandal that would bore readers to tears. When the receptionist called, there was a man in the lobby asking for her specifically, no appointment. He wouldn't give his name. But he said it was urgent, that it concerned national security. Sarah almost said no. Walk-ins were usually cranks, conspiracy theorists, people who saw hidden meanings in everything. But something in the receptionist's voice made her curious. 5 minutes later, she was sitting across from Daniel Ashford in a small conference room, watching as he methodically laid out documents across the table like a dealer spreading cards. Daniel didn't introduce himself at first. He just started talking, his voice steady but strained, like a man who hadn't slept in days. He told her about Operation Nightfall, a covert program funded by a consortium of American corporations, including Ashford Industries. The operation had been running for nearly 5 years, funneling money and weapons to anti-communist forces in Southeast Asia and Latin America, operating completely outside official government channels. It was illegal, unconstitutional, and it had already cost hundreds of lives. Sarah listened, her journalist's instincts warring with her skepticism. Stories like this came across her desk every month, usually from people with axes to grind or mental illness to manage. But the documents were different. Bank statements, transfer receipts, internal memos written on Ashford Industries' letterhead. And then Daniel told her who he was and everything changed. The son of Richard Ashford doesn't walk into a newspaper office with evidence against his own family unless something has broken inside him, unless the moral weight has become too heavy to carry alone. Sarah looked at Daniel's hands as he spoke, noticed how they trembled slightly as he turned pages, how his voice caught when he mentioned his father's name. This wasn't a disgruntled employee or a rival trying to damage the Ashfords. This was a man committing familial suicide, burning down his own house because he couldn't stand to live in it anymore. Sarah asked the obvious question. Why her? Why the Post? Daniel's answer was simple. He had researched every major journalist in Washington. Sarah Chen had a reputation for thoroughness, for not backing down from powerful people, for caring more about truth than access. He needed someone who wouldn't be bought, who wouldn't be intimidated, who would see this through no matter what happened. What Daniel didn't tell her, what Sarah would only learn later, was that he had already tried to stop Operation Nightfall from the inside. He had gone to his brother Marcus first, hoping that together they could convince their father to shut it down, to end it before anyone got hurt. But Marcus had looked at his younger brother with something close to pity, and told him to grow up, to understand that this was how the world worked, that their father was protecting American interests in ways that small minds couldn't comprehend. Daniel had then gone to Victoria, his sister, hoping she would be different, that her work with the charitable foundation had kept her moral compass intact. But Victoria had been even worse than Marcus. She had been angry, accusing Daniel of betraying the family, of not understanding the sacrifices that had been made to build what they had. She had told him that if he pursued this, if he went outside the family with his concerns, he would be disowned, cut off, erased from the Ashford legacy as if he had never existed. So Daniel had made his choice. He chose truth over family, justice over loyalty, his conscience over his inheritance. And on that August evening in 1973, sitting across from Sarah Chen in a cramped conference room at the Washington Post, he set in motion a chain of events that would bring down not just his family, but a network of powerful men who had believed themselves untouchable. Sarah worked on the story for 6 weeks. She verified every document, cross-referenced every claim, built a case so airtight that even the Ashford family's lawyers wouldn't be able to tear it down. She brought in her editor, then the senior editors, then the Post's legal team. Everyone agreed. This was the story of the decade. This was bigger than Watergate, which was still unfolding in the background. This was proof that America's corporate elite were running their own foreign policy, conducting their own wars, accountable to no one but themselves. Daniel stayed in hiding during those 6 weeks. He knew what was coming. He knew that the moment the story broke, his life as he had known it would be over. Sarah helped him find a small apartment in Alexandria under a false name. They met every few days so he could answer her questions, fill in gaps, provide context for the documents he had stolen from his father's files. It was during one of these meetings that Sarah asked Daniel the question that had been bothering her from the start. Why did his father do it? Richard Ashford already had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. He had power, influence, respect. What did he gain from Operation Nightfall that he didn't already have? Daniel was quiet for a long time before answering. Then he told Sarah about his grandfather, William Ashford, who had died when Daniel was 12. William had been obsessed with the idea that America was in decline, that weak politicians and foolish voters were squandering the power that the greatest generation had won. William had believed that men of vision, men of strength, needed to take matters into their own hands, to steer the country away from the abyss regardless of what the law said. Richard had inherited that belief, that sense of divine mission. He genuinely believed he was saving America, that Operation Nightfall was a patriotic duty, and he had convinced other men, titans of industry and finance, to join him. Together, they had created a shadow government, accountable to no one, guided only by their own vision of what America should be. The story ran on the front page of the Washington Post on October 14th, 1973. The headline was simple and devastating: Private War. How American corporations secretly armed foreign militias. Sarah Chen's byline was accompanied by photographs of documents, bank statements, and a single photograph of Richard Ashford at a gala, smiling, untouchable, surrounded by senators and generals. The reaction was immediate and explosive. By noon, Richard Ashford's lawyers had filed a lawsuit against the Post. By evening, the FBI had opened an investigation. By the next morning, 3 senators were calling for hearings, and the stock price of Ashford Industries had dropped 30%. The empire that Samuel Ashford had started in the coal mines of Pennsylvania, that William had built through the Depression, that Richard had transformed into a monument to American corporate power, was beginning to crumble. But the real war, the secret war that would destroy the Ashford family completely, was only just beginning. Richard Ashford did not become one of the most powerful men in America by surrendering when challenged. Within 24 hours of the Washington Post's story breaking, he had assembled a war council in the executive boardroom of Ashford Tower, a room that had witnessed billion-dollar deals and the downfall of competitors, but never the existential threat the family now faced. Around that mahogany table sat not just Richard's inner circle, but some of the most formidable legal and political minds that money could buy. The strategy was multifaceted and ruthless. First, destroy the credibility of the story. Richard's communications team immediately began planting seeds of doubt, suggesting that the documents had been forged, that Daniel Ashford was mentally unstable, that Sarah Chen had a history of sensationalist journalism, which was a lie, but a lie that would take time to disprove. Second, pressure the Post through every available channel. Advertisers who did business with Ashford Industries were quietly informed that their continued relationship with the newspaper might be problematic. Board members of the Post's parent company received phone calls from very important people, suggesting that perhaps the story had been insufficiently vetted. Third, and most importantly, make Daniel disappear, not physically, but socially, legally, existentially. Marcus Ashford took personal charge of the campaign against his younger brother. If there was any remaining affection between them, any residual bond of brotherhood, Marcus buried it beneath layers of cold calculation. He understood what Daniel had done wasn't just betrayal of the family. It was an attack on everything the Ashfords represented, everything they had built over 3 generations. And Marcus would respond with overwhelming force. The legal assault began immediately. Daniel was sued for theft of corporate documents, for breach of fiduciary duty, for violating non-disclosure agreements he had signed when he joined the company. The lawsuits were designed not to win, but to drain Daniel's resources, to force him to spend money he didn't have on lawyers he couldn't afford. Because here was the cruel arithmetic of Daniel's situation. He had walked away from a family fortune estimated at $2 billion, but he personally had almost nothing. The trust funds, the investments, the property, everything was controlled by the family, and the family had cut him off completely. But Marcus went further. He hired private investigators to dig into every corner of Daniel's life, looking for anything that could be used to discredit him. They found a marijuana possession charge from Daniel's college days that had been quietly dismissed. They found an ex-girlfriend willing to say that Daniel had always been unstable, prone to conspiracy theories. They found a psychiatrist who had treated Daniel for depression during his freshman year at Yale. None of it was particularly damaging on its own, but woven together and fed to friendly journalists, it created a narrative. Daniel Ashford was a troubled young man, jealous of his successful siblings, angry at his father, willing to lie and steal to get attention. Victoria Ashford, meanwhile, took to the social battlefield. She gave carefully calibrated interviews to society magazines, dabbing at her eyes as she talked about how painful it was to watch her youngest brother self-destruct, how the family had tried to get him help, how they still loved him despite what he had done. She was brilliant at it, playing the role of the grieving sister, while simultaneously planting the knife between Daniel's ribs. The charitable foundation she ran issued a statement expressing deep concern about the allegations, but noting that they had full confidence in Richard Ashford's integrity and patriotism. For a few weeks, the Ashford strategy seemed to be working. The initial outrage began to fade as other stories competed for attention. The Watergate scandal was reaching its climax, and the media had limited bandwidth. Some journalists began questioning whether the Post had been too credulous, whether they had verified the documents sufficiently, whether Daniel Ashford's motives were as pure as Sarah Chen had suggested. Richard Ashford appeared on national television, dignified and measured, more in sorrow than in anger, talking about the difficulty of watching a son lose his way, while carefully not denying any of the specific allegations. But then something unexpected happened. Other whistleblowers began to emerge. A mid-level accountant at Ashford Industries came forward with additional documents. A former CIA analyst confirmed that he had been aware of Operation Nightfall, but had been ordered to look the other way. A journalist in Guatemala reported that American weapons bearing serial numbers traced back to Ashford front companies had been used in a massacre of union organizers. The story that the Ashfords were trying to bury kept growing, metastasizing, spreading beyond their ability to contain it. The congressional hearings began in November of 1973. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence had been formed earlier that year in response to revelations about CIA domestic spying, and Operation Nightfall fell squarely within their mandate. The hearings were televised, and America watched as senators grilled Richard Ashford under oath, as documents were entered into evidence, as the machinery of American corporate power was exposed to sunlight for the first time in decades. Richard Ashford was masterful on the stand. He admitted nothing, remembered little, deferred to counsel frequently. When pressed about specific operations, he invoked national security. When asked about the legality of Operation Nightfall, he suggested that patriotic Americans sometimes had to make difficult choices. When confronted with documents bearing his signature, he questioned their authenticity. He was calm, dignified, utterly in control. And yet, the damage was being done. With every evasion, every non-answer, every carefully parsed phrase, the American public was getting a glimpse behind the curtain, seeing how power really operated. Daniel was called to testify in December. Sarah Chen sat in the gallery, watching as the young man who had walked into her office 4 months earlier took the oath and faced his father across the hearing room. The Ashford family lawyers had tried everything to prevent Daniel from testifying, claiming attorney-client privilege, executive privilege, trade secret protection. But the committee had been insistent, and eventually Daniel sat in the witness chair and began to speak. His testimony was devastating, not because it was dramatic or emotional, but because it was precise and damning. Daniel walked the senators through Operation Nightfall step by step, explaining how money was laundered through shell companies, how weapons were procured and shipped, how politicians and military officers were paid off. He named names, provided dates, connected dots that the senators hadn't even known existed. And through it all, Richard Ashford sat behind his lawyers, his face a mask, giving nothing away. The most powerful moment came near the end of Daniel's testimony, when Senator Howard Church of Massachusetts asked him a simple question. "Mr. Ashford, why did you come forward? You had to know this would destroy your family, cost you everything. Why did you do it?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Because I was raised to believe that the Ashford name meant something, that it stood for integrity, for doing what was right even when it was hard. My grandfather came to this country with nothing and built an empire through honest work. My father taught me that with great power comes great responsibility, and when I discovered that he was using that power to circumvent the Constitution, to conduct illegal wars, to put American weapons in the hands of people who would use them to murder civilians, I had a choice. I could be loyal to my family, or I could be loyal to the principles my family claimed to represent. I chose the principles." It was a devastating answer, made more so by its quiet delivery. Richard Ashford's face remained impassive, but those who knew him well noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the barely perceptible clench of his jaw. His son had just called him a hypocrite on national television, had suggested that the Ashford Empire was built on lies, and there was nothing Richard could do about it. The hearings continued through the winter and into the spring of 1974. More witnesses testified, more documents were revealed, more connections were made. It became clear that Operation Nightfall was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, a network of corporate and government actors who had been conducting off-the-books operations for years, perhaps decades. The Ashfords were at the center of it, but they were far from alone. By April, the political pressure had become unsustainable. The Justice Department announced indictments against Richard Ashford and 6 other corporate executives on charges ranging from weapons trafficking to tax evasion to conspiracy to defraud the United States. The stock price of Ashford Industries had fallen 70%. Banks were calling in loans. Partners were fleeing. The empire that had seemed so solid, so permanent, was collapsing with stunning speed. And through it all, the Ashford family was tearing itself apart from within, brother against brother, father against son, in a war that would leave no survivors. The trial of Richard Ashford began on a humid morning in June of 1974 in the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan. Outside, protesters held signs both supporting and condemning the man who had once been considered a titan of American industry. Inside, the courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and curious citizens who had managed to secure one of the limited public seats. The Ashford family sat in the front row behind the defense table, a united front for the cameras. Marcus stone-faced in his tailored suit, Victoria elegant and composed, Elizabeth Ashford, Richard's wife, looking every bit the dignified matriarch standing by her husband. Daniel was notably absent. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. They presented the documents that Daniel had provided to Sarah Chen, along with dozens more obtained through subpoenas and search warrants. They called witnesses who testified about secret meetings in luxury hotels, about coded conversations, about briefcases full of cash changing hands in parking garages. They played recordings of phone calls in which Richard and his co-conspirators discussed operations in language that was carefully vague but unmistakably criminal. The portrait that emerged was of a man who believed himself above the law, who had created a parallel government answerable only to corporate interests. Richard's defense team, led by legendary attorney Theodore Marks, attempted to frame everything in terms of patriotism and national security. They argued that Richard Ashford had been working with elements of the intelligence community to protect American interests at a time when official policy was weak and vacillating. They suggested that much of what the prosecution characterized as illegal was actually sanctioned at the highest levels of government, though they couldn't produce documentation to prove it because they claimed such operations required deniability. They painted Daniel as a misguided idealist who didn't understand the complexities of geopolitics, who had been manipulated by anti-American journalists with their own agenda. But the defense's strongest argument wasn't legal, it was emotional. Theodore Marks spent considerable time during his opening statement talking about what it meant to be betrayed by your own son, to have your family destroyed by someone you loved and raised. He pointed out that Daniel stood to gain nothing from his betrayal, which the defense argued proved not his nobility, but his irrationality. What kind of son, Marks asked the jury, destroys his own father? What kind of man burns down everything his family had built over 3 generations? It was a clever strategy, because it placed the jury in an uncomfortable position. Even if Richard Ashford was guilty of the crimes charged, even if he had broken the law, there was something viscerally disturbing about a son testifying against his father. The prosecution knew they had to address this directly, and they did so through their star witness, Daniel Ashford himself. Daniel took the stand in the second week of the trial. He had lost weight since the hearings, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and psychological strain. Sarah Chen, watching from the press gallery, barely recognized the confident young man who had walked into her office 10 months earlier. The government's machinery of justice, combined with his family's campaign of character assassination, had taken a visible toll. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Margaret Sullivan, began gently, walking Daniel through his background, his education, his work at Ashford Industries. She established him as credible, intelligent, someone who had been groomed for corporate leadership. Then she asked him to explain what he had discovered and why he had come forward. Daniel's testimony was essentially the same as what he had told the Senate committee, but in the intimate setting of a courtroom with his father sitting just 20 feet away, it carried a different weight. The cross-examination was brutal. Theodore Marks was one of the best defense attorneys in America, and he knew that if he could break Daniel on the stand, if he could make him seem vindictive or unstable, he could create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jury. Marks began by asking about Daniel's relationship with his father growing up. Wasn't it true that Daniel had always felt overshadowed by his older brother Marcus? Wasn't it true that Richard had been disappointed when Daniel chose to study art history rather than business? Wasn't it true that Daniel had been in therapy for depression and anxiety? Daniel answered each question carefully, admitting what was true while refusing to accept the characterization that Marks was trying to impose. Yes, he had sometimes felt pressure to live up to his family's expectations. Yes, his father had wanted him to focus on business. Yes, he had sought help for mental health issues, which he considered a sign of strength, not weakness. But none of that, Daniel insisted, changed the facts of what his father had done. Then Marks asked the question that everyone in the courtroom had been waiting for. "Mr. Ashford, do you love your father?" The courtroom went silent. Daniel looked at Richard for the first time since taking the stand. Richard met his gaze, his expression unreadable. The moment stretched out, painful and intimate and utterly public. "I love the man I thought he was," Daniel finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I love the father who taught me right from wrong, who told me that the Ashford name stood for integrity. But I don't know anymore if that man ever existed, or if it was always a lie." It was a devastating answer, one that cut through all the legal maneuvering and procedural arguments to the heart of the tragedy. Richard Ashford's face remained impassive, but Victoria, sitting behind him, began to cry quietly. Marcus stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched tight. The trial continued for 6 more weeks. The prosecution called dozens of witnesses, presented hundreds of exhibits, built a case so comprehensive that conviction seemed inevitable. But the defense fought every point, challenged every witness, created alternative explanations for incriminating evidence. And through it all, the Ashford family's internal war continued to escalate. Marcus had taken control of what remained of Ashford Industries, fighting a desperate battle to keep the company solvent, while his father faced potential imprisonment. He made brutal decisions, selling off divisions, laying off thousands of workers, cutting ties with anyone even tangentially connected to Operation Nightfall. He gave interviews blaming Daniel for the destruction of the family business, accusing him of naivety and betrayal. "My brother doesn't understand that in the real world, difficult choices have to be made," Marcus told Fortune magazine. "He's destroyed our family over his childish idealism." Victoria, meanwhile, had become obsessed with salvaging the family's social standing. She gave more interviews, wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal defending her father, organized a letter-writing campaign asking the judge for leniency. She contacted every influential person she knew, calling in favors, applying pressure, trying to shape the narrative. And she made it clear that when this was over, when the legal battles were finished, Daniel would not be welcomed back into the family under any circumstances. He had made his choice, and there would be no forgiveness. Elizabeth Ashford, Richard's wife and the matriarch of the family, had remained largely silent throughout the ordeal. She sat in the courtroom every day, composed and elegant, supporting her husband publicly while privately struggling with the revelation of who he really was. Friends said she had aged 10 years in 10 months, that the strain was destroying her health. But she never wavered in her public support, never gave any indication of doubt or recrimination. Daniel, for his part, had become increasingly isolated. The few friends who had stood by him initially began to drift away under pressure from their own families, from business associates who didn't want to be associated with someone who had betrayed the Ashfords. Sarah Chen remained one of his few allies, meeting with him occasionally to check on his well-being, though they both knew their relationship was complicated by her role as a journalist covering the story. In late July, something happened that changed everything. A former Ashford Industries security chief named Thomas Brennan came forward with new information. Brennan had been fired during Marcus's purge of the company, and he was angry. He told prosecutors that in the weeks following the Washington Post story, Marcus and Victoria had met with several of the co-conspirators in Operation Nightfall and discussed ways to make Daniel recant his testimony. They had considered offering him money, threatening him with additional lawsuits, even, according to Brennan, darker options that Brennan refused to elaborate on publicly. The revelation that Marcus and Victoria might have conspired to obstruct justice sent shockwaves through the trial. The prosecution immediately sought to add them as defendants, arguing that they had attempted to intimidate a witness and tamper with evidence. The defense claimed that Brennan was a disgruntled former employee, making things up for revenge. But the damage was done. The facade of family unity had cracked, revealing the desperation and moral decay beneath. The judge allowed the new charges to proceed, and suddenly the trial expanded. Marcus and Victoria were brought in for questioning, fingerprinted and photographed like common criminals, the ultimate humiliation for people who had lived their entire lives in privilege and luxury. Victoria maintained her composure in public, but those close to her said she was falling apart in private, unable to comprehend how her loyalty to her father had led to her own prosecution. Marcus was defiant, insisting that everything he had done was to protect the family, that in any case there was no proof of Brennan's allegations. But the prosecution had more than Brennan's word. They had phone records showing calls between Marcus, Victoria, and the other Operation Nightfall conspirators. They had financial records showing payments to individuals who had then approached Daniel with offers and threats. They had testimony from Daniel himself about the pressure campaign, the lawyers who had told him he could make it all go away if he just admitted he had made a mistake, the anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night warning him that he was making powerful enemies. By the time the prosecution rested its case in early August, the trial had become a spectacle of family destruction unlike anything in American legal history. 3 members of one of America's most powerful families sat at the defense table, facing decades in prison. The 4th member, Daniel, sat in the witness gallery, having testified against all of them, and Elizabeth Ashford sat alone in the front row, watching her family destroy itself while the world looked on. The jury deliberated for 3 days before reaching their verdict. The jury returned on a Thursday afternoon in mid-August, 1974. The heat in Manhattan was oppressive, the kind of thick humidity that makes every breath feel like work. Inside the courthouse, the air conditioning struggled to keep up with the packed courtroom. Every seat was filled, journalists stood shoulder to shoulder in the back, and outside hundreds of people waited for news, some supporting the Ashfords, others calling for their imprisonment. When the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict, the courtroom fell into a silence so profound that the rustling of a single piece of paper sounded like thunder. Richard Ashford sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table before him, his face revealing nothing. Marcus and Victoria flanked their father, a broken trinity of what had once been American royalty. Elizabeth Ashford gripped the railing in front of her, her knuckles white. Daniel sat in the back, having been warned by federal marshals that his presence in the main gallery might provoke a scene. The foreman cleared his throat and began to read. Count 1, conspiracy to violate the Arms Export Control Act, guilty. Count 2, wire fraud, guilty. Count 3, tax evasion, guilty. The litany continued, charge after charge, guilty, guilty, guilty. Richard Ashford was convicted on 17 of 19 counts. Marcus was convicted on 8 counts related to obstruction of justice and witness tampering. Victoria was convicted on 6 similar counts. The cumulative weight of the verdicts represented potential sentences that could keep all 3 in prison for the rest of their lives. When the foreman finished reading, there was a moment of stunned silence, and then chaos erupted. Journalists rushed for the doors to file their stories. Supporters of the Ashfords began shouting about injustice and political persecution. Daniel sat motionless in his seat, tears streaming down his face, whether from relief or grief or some combination of both, no one could say. Elizabeth Ashford collapsed and had to be helped from the courtroom by friends, and Richard Ashford, for the first time in the entire ordeal, showed emotion. His shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly, and those sitting close enough saw his hands begin to tremble before he clenched them into fists. The sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks later, in October of 1974. The prosecution asked for the maximum sentence, arguing that Richard Ashford had betrayed the public trust, had used his wealth and influence to circumvent the Constitution, and had shown no remorse whatsoever. The defense pleaded for leniency, citing Richard's age. He was now 53, his history of philanthropy, and the fact that he had genuinely believed he was serving his country's interests, however misguided that belief might have been. Dozens of letters were submitted on Richard's behalf, from senators and generals, from business leaders and academics, all testifying to his character and contributions to American society. But the judge, the Honorable Samuel Rutherford, was unmoved. In his sentencing statement, Judge Rutherford spoke for nearly an hour about the nature of power and accountability, about how the law must apply equally to rich and poor, to powerful and powerless. Mr. Ashford, the judge said, looking directly at Richard, you have been blessed with advantages that most Americans can only dream of. You had wealth, education, influence, access to the corridors of power. You could have used those blessings to serve this nation honorably. Instead, you chose to place yourself above the law to substitute your judgment for that of the American people and their elected representatives. This court cannot and will not countenance such arrogance. Richard Ashford was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Marcus received 12 years. Victoria received 8 years. The courtroom erupted again, this time with gasps and cries. Elizabeth Ashford had to be sedated and taken to the hospital. And once again, Daniel sat alone in the back of the courtroom, the architect of his family's destruction, wondering if he had done the right thing or simply unleashed a catastrophe that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Ashford Empire, already crippled by legal fees and collapsing stock prices, now entered its death throes. Marcus, before reporting to prison, had made arrangements for a caretaker board to manage what remained of Ashford Industries, but without the family's leadership, and with their reputation in ruins, the company was essentially worthless. Banks foreclosed on loans, investors sued for mismanagement, employees found new jobs. By the end of 1974, Ashford Industries, the conglomerate that had taken 3 generations to build, was being carved up and sold for parts. The Ashford Mansion on Fifth Avenue was put up for sale to pay legal fees and restitution. The art collection that Richard had spent decades assembling went to auction. The charitable foundation that Victoria had run was dissolved amid allegations that it had been used to launder money for Operation Nightfall. The beach house in the Hamptons, the ski lodge in Aspen, the apartment in Paris, all of it was sold off. The liquidation of the Ashford fortune was swift and merciless, a capitalist-feeding frenzy, as rivals and creditors descended on the carcass of what had once seemed invincible. Richard Ashford was sent to a federal correctional institution in Pennsylvania, not far from where his grandfather Samuel had worked in the coal mines a century earlier. There was a cruel symmetry to it, the empire rising from those mines, and now, in a sense, returning to them. Richard maintained his composure even in prison, refusing interviews, keeping to himself, reading extensively. Those who knew him said he had retreated into himself, that whatever fire had driven him to build and scheme and manipulate had been extinguished by the verdict and the collapse of everything he had worked for. Marcus and Victoria were sent to separate minimum security facilities, as befitted white-collar criminals of their class. Marcus reportedly spent his time working on a memoir that would never be published, trying to make sense of how his life had gone so catastrophically wrong. Victoria taught literacy classes to other inmates and wrote long letters to her mother that Elizabeth could barely bring herself to read. Both maintained their anger at Daniel, blaming him for destroying not just their father, but the entire family structure that had defined their lives. Elizabeth Ashford moved to a small apartment on the Upper East Side, living on what remained of her personal savings after the legal bills were paid. She became a recluse, rarely leaving her apartment, seeing only a few old friends who remained loyal despite everything. The vibrant socialite who had once hosted presidents and celebrities at her dinner parties became a ghost, haunted by the ruins of her former life. She refused all contact with Daniel, returning his letters unopened, hanging up if he called. In her mind, he had killed her family as surely as if he had used a gun. And Daniel? Daniel Ashford found himself in a peculiar kind of purgatory. He was simultaneously a hero and a pariah, celebrated by some as a courageous whistleblower who had sacrificed everything for the truth, reviled by others as a traitor who had destroyed his own family. He couldn't find work in corporate America. No company wanted to hire someone with a reputation for exposing their secrets. He couldn't return to the art world he had loved. His former connections had been through family money and influence that no longer existed. Sarah Chen continued to cover the aftermath of the Ashford scandal, winning a Pulitzer Prize for her reporting. She and Daniel remained in contact, meeting occasionally for coffee, though their relationship was complicated by the fact that she was still a journalist and he was still a story. She watched him struggle with depression and guilt, watched him question whether the cost had been worth it, watched him slowly realize that there was no going back to who he had been before that August day in 1973 when he had walked into her office. The question that haunted Daniel, the question he asked Sarah over coffee in quiet cafes where he wouldn't be recognized, was whether he had actually accomplished anything. Yes, his father and siblings were in prison. Yes, Operation Nightfall had been shut down. Yes, there had been congressional hearings and new oversight mechanisms put in place. But had anything really changed? Were there not dozens of other Operation Nightfalls still running, conducted by other powerful families and corporations who had simply learned to be more careful? Had he destroyed his family for nothing more than a symbolic victory? Sarah tried to reassure him that what he had done mattered, that exposing corruption and holding the powerful accountable was always worthwhile, even if it couldn't fix everything. But she could see the doubt in his eyes, the growing suspicion that he had traded his family and his future for a Pyrrhic victory that would be forgotten as soon as the next scandal came along. By 1976, 2 years after the verdicts, the Ashford scandal had largely faded from public consciousness. Watergate and Nixon's resignation had dominated the headlines, followed by the fall of Saigon, the bicentennial celebrations, the presidential campaign. The Ashfords became a footnote, a cautionary tale invoked occasionally in congressional hearings or journalism schools, but no longer a living, breathing news story. Daniel moved to a small town in Vermont, changing his name legally to Daniel Stern, trying to build a life disconnected from the toxic legacy of his birth. He worked odd jobs, painted landscapes that he sold at local galleries, tried to find some measure of peace. But the past wouldn't let him go. He received threatening letters from people who blamed him for the loss of their jobs when Ashford Industries collapsed. He received admiring letters from activists who saw him as a hero, which somehow felt worse because he didn't feel heroic at all. And every few months a journalist would track him down, wanting to interview him about the family, the trial, the price of conscience. In prison, Richard Ashford's health began to fail. The stress of the trial and conviction, combined with a lifetime of heavy drinking and smoking, caught up with him. In 1977, he suffered a heart attack and spent 3 weeks in the prison hospital. He survived, but those who saw him said he was a shadow of the man who had once commanded boardrooms and bent senators to his will. He was granted compassionate release in 1979. His sentence commuted due to failing health, and he moved in with Elizabeth in her small apartment. The reunion between Richard and Elizabeth was not warm. She cared for him out of duty and perhaps some residue of the love she had once felt, but the man in her apartment was a stranger wearing her husband's face. He was diminished, broken, haunted by the empire he had lost and the son who had betrayed him. They lived together in near silence, two people bound by history and habit, but separated by an unbridgeable gulf of disappointment and grief. Richard Ashford died in his sleep on a cold January night in 1980. He was 59 years old. The obituaries were small and factual, noting his conviction and the scandal, but also acknowledging his earlier accomplishments. There was no state funeral, no gathering of the powerful to pay their respects. Just a small service attended by Elizabeth Marcus, who had been released on parole, Victoria, who was still serving her sentence but was granted leave to attend, and a handful of old associates who remembered the man Richard had been before the fall. Daniel was not invited, and he did not attend. But when he heard the news, he sat alone in his small Vermont house and wept, mourning not the man his father had actually been, but the man he had wanted his father to be, the man who had never really existed except in a son's hopeful imagination. The years that followed Richard Ashford's death were years of quiet dissolution, the slow fading of a family that had once seemed eternal. Marcus was released from prison in 1982, having served 10 years of his 12-year sentence, with time off for good behavior. He emerged into a world that had moved on without him, a world where the Ashford name meant nothing, or worse, meant scandal and downfall. He was 42 years old, but he looked a decade older, his hair grey, his face lined with bitterness and regret. Marcus tried to rebuild. He used what little money remained from the family fortune, funds that had been protected in trusts that the creditors couldn't touch, to start a small investment firm. But no one wanted to invest with a convicted felon, no matter how brilliant he might have been before his fall. The doors that had once opened automatically for an Ashford were now firmly closed. Former colleagues avoided his calls. Business partners who had once courted his favor now treated him like a stranger, or worse, like a reminder of their own moral compromises. He lived alone in a modest apartment in Brooklyn, far from the Fifth Avenue mansion where he had grown up. He never married, never had children, never rebuilt anything approaching the life he had once taken for granted. Friends said he remained consumed by anger at Daniel, that every conversation eventually turned to the betrayal, the unfairness, the destruction of everything the family had built. Marcus could not, or would not, accept any responsibility for what had happened. In his mind, he had been protecting American interests, following his father's vision, doing what strong men had always done. It was Daniel who had been weak, Daniel who had been naive, Daniel who had destroyed them all. Victoria was released in 1981, having served 7 years. Unlike Marcus, she tried to make peace with what had happened, or at least to understand it. She moved to California, as far from New York and the ghosts of her former life as she could get. She worked with various non-profit organizations, using her organizational skills and her hard-earned understanding of how power corrupts to help others. She never spoke publicly about the scandal, never gave interviews, never tried to rehabilitate the Ashford name. She simply tried to live quietly and do some good in the world. But the past haunted her too. She suffered from depression and anxiety, spent years in therapy trying to process the trauma of watching her family destroy itself. She had nightmares about the trial, about watching her father being led away in handcuffs, about the look on Daniel's face when he testified against them. She understood intellectually that Daniel had been right, that their father had been breaking the law, that Operation Nightfall had been morally and legally wrong. But understanding didn't make the loss any easier to bear, didn't bridge the chasm between her and the brother she had once loved. Elizabeth Ashford lived until 1993, dying quietly in her sleep at the age of 76. She spent the last 13 years of her life after Richard's death in that same small apartment, living on social security and the kindness of a few remaining friends. The woman who had once hosted charity galas, attended by hundreds, now went days without speaking to another person. She maintained contact with Marcus and Victoria, but the relationships were strained, complicated by shared trauma and competing narratives about what had happened and why. Elizabeth never reconciled with Daniel. In her final years, when Victoria gently suggested that perhaps it was time to forgive, that Daniel had been trying to do what he thought was right, Elizabeth refused. "He killed his father," she would say, as if that settled the matter. "He destroyed our family. There is no forgiveness for that." She died still believing that Daniel had been the villain of the story, that everything would have been fine if he had just kept silent, just been loyal, just accepted that the Ashfords operated by different rules than ordinary people. Daniel learned of his mother's death through a brief phone call from Victoria, the first time they had spoken in 20 years. Victoria told him about the funeral arrangements, then paused, waiting to see if Daniel would ask if he was welcome. He didn't ask. He knew the answer. After they hung up, Daniel sat in his studio, surrounded by the landscape paintings that had become his livelihood and his therapy, and cried for the mother he had lost long before her death, for the family that had ceased to exist the moment he walked into Sarah Chen's office with his briefcase full of damning documents. By the 1990s, Daniel had built a life of sorts. He had remarried to a kind woman named Rebecca, who knew his story but loved him anyway, who understood the weight he carried and didn't ask him to be anything other than who he was. They had a daughter, Emma, born in 1985, and Daniel threw himself into fatherhood with a fierce determination to be different from his own father, to teach his daughter that integrity mattered more than wealth, that doing the right thing was worth any cost. But the question of whether he had done the right thing never left him. On nights when sleep wouldn't come, Daniel would lie awake wondering if there had been another way, if he could have stopped Operation Nightfall without destroying his family, if the price had been too high. Rebecca would remind him that he had saved lives, that the weapons that would have flowed through Operation Nightfall had been stopped, that corrupt systems had been exposed. But Daniel knew the arithmetic was more complicated than that. Other operations had replaced Nightfall. Other powerful families and corporations had learned to be more careful, more discreet. The system had survived his exposure of one small part of it. Sarah Chen remained in Daniel's life as a friend, one of the few people who truly understood what he had been through. She had gone on to a distinguished career in journalism, covering Watergate, the Iran-Contra scandal, the savings and loan crisis. She had become one of the most respected investigative reporters in America, and she always credited Daniel with teaching her the most important lesson of her career, that the truth matters, even when revealing it costs everything. In 2003, Sarah published a book about the Ashford scandal titled The Banished Heir, the Secret War That Destroyed One of America's Most Powerful Families. It was meticulously researched, drawing on court documents, congressional testimony, and interviews with everyone involved who was still alive and willing to talk. Daniel cooperated fully, spending hours being interviewed, allowing Sarah to tell his story with all its complexity and pain. Marcus refused to participate, still bitter, still angry. Victoria contributed a brief written statement acknowledging that the family had been wrong, but asking for privacy and understanding. The book was a critical success and a modest commercial one. It won awards, was assigned in college courses on ethics and journalism, sparked discussions about whistleblowing and family loyalty. For a few months, the Ashford scandal was back in the news, dissected by a new generation that had no memory of the original events. Daniel gave a handful of interviews, speaking carefully about the choices he had made and the life he had built afterward. He came across as thoughtful and sad, a man who had done what he believed was right and paid a terrible price for it, but who would make the same choice again if faced with the same circumstances. Marcus died in 2007 at the age of 67. He had a heart attack while walking to his small office in Brooklyn, collapsing on the street and dying before the ambulance arrived. His funeral was small, attended by Victoria, a few former colleagues, and Daniel, who came despite knowing his presence might not be welcome. As he stood at his brother's grave, Daniel remembered the boy Marcus had been before ambition, and loyalty to their father had twisted him into something else. He remembered playing together as children, remembered looking up to his older brother, remembered when the world had seemed simpler and the Ashford family had seemed blessed rather than cursed. Victoria lived until 2018, dying at 72 after a long battle with cancer. In her final years, she had achieved something like peace, or at least acceptance. She had rebuilt relationships with Daniel and Rebecca, had become a beloved aunt to Emma and Emma's children. She never fully forgave Daniel for what he had done, but she came to understand it, to see it not as betrayal but as a different kind of loyalty, loyalty to principles rather than to people. At her funeral, Daniel gave the eulogy, speaking about the complexity of family, about how the people we love can do terrible things and remain loved, about forgiveness and understanding and the long road to reconciliation. Sarah Chen retired from journalism in 2015, but remained active as a teacher and speaker. She taught ethics and investigative reporting at Columbia University, using the Ashford case as a central example in her courses. Her students were always fascinated by the story, by the moral complexity of it, by the question of whether Daniel had been heroic or destructive or somehow both. Sarah would tell them that the easy stories, the ones with clear heroes and villains, were almost always lies. Real life was messier, more complicated, more human than that. Daniel continued to paint, his work becoming more sought after as he aged. Critics noted a melancholy quality to his landscapes, a sense of loss and longing that made them beautiful and haunting. He painted the Vermont countryside, where he had fled to rebuild his life, the mountains and forests and small towns that had given him refuge when New York had become unbearable. His paintings sold well enough to support a comfortable life, and he donated most of the proceeds to organizations fighting corruption and supporting whistleblowers, trying to make something meaningful from the wreckage of his family. In 2020, Daniel Ashford, formerly Daniel Stern, turned 71 years old. He was a grandfather now, with 3 grandchildren who knew him only as a gentle old man who painted and told stories, who had no idea of the empire he had come from or the empire he had destroyed. Emma had told them some version of the story, carefully edited for age appropriateness, but to them it was ancient history, as remote as the Revolutionary War or the Great Depression. On the anniversary of the day he had walked into Sarah Chen's office 47 years earlier, Daniel sat in his studio and thought about everything that had happened, everything that had been lost and gained. His father was dead. His mother was dead. Marcus was dead. Victoria was dead. The Ashford Empire was gone, scattered to the winds, remembered only in history books and journalism courses. He had a new family, a good life, work he loved. He had done what he believed was right, and he had paid a price so high it still sometimes took his breath away. But had it been worth it? That was the question that still haunted him, that he suspected would haunt him until his own death. He thought about the people who might have been killed by weapons that Operation Nightfall would have provided, lives saved by his exposure of the scheme. He thought about the congressional reforms that had followed the scandal, the oversight mechanisms that had been put in place, however imperfect they might be. He thought about the students Sarah taught, the journalists who cited his case as inspiration for their own investigations, the whistleblowers who came forward in later years and mentioned his example as giving them courage. And he thought about his daughter Emma, who had grown up understanding that integrity mattered more than wealth or power, that standing up for what was right sometimes meant standing alone, that the easy path and the right path were rarely the same. He thought about his grandchildren, growing up in a world where they were taught to question authority, to demand accountability from the powerful, to believe that one person really could make a difference. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that had to be enough. Because the alternative, believing that it had all been for nothing, that he had destroyed his family for a symbolic gesture that changed nothing, was unbearable. Daniel picked up his brush and turned to the canvas before him, a half-finished landscape of a winter forest. The trees were bare, their branches stark against a grey sky, but there was light breaking through the clouds in the distance, a suggestion of spring to come, of life persisting despite everything. He painted slowly, carefully, adding detail and depth, trying, as he always did, to capture not just what he saw but what he felt, to transform pain and loss and regret into something beautiful. Outside his studio window, snow began to fall, covering Vermont in white silence. Inside, an old man painted, carrying within him the weight of an empire's fall and the hope that from those ashes something better might grow. The Ashford name was gone, but Daniel remained, a living reminder that conscience has a cost but also a value beyond price, that sometimes the only way to save your soul is to lose everything else. And in the end, perhaps that was the real inheritance. Not the billions that had been lost or the power that had crumbled, but the understanding that every choice has consequences, that we are defined not by what we inherit, but by what we do with it, that the hardest battles are not fought in boardrooms or courtrooms, but in the human heart, where loyalty and integrity wage their eternal war. The Ashford Empire was gone, but the question it raised, the terrible choice between family and truth, between loyalty and justice, would endure as long as there were people willing to ask themselves what they would do if faced with the same impossible decision. And that, Daniel thought as he painted his winter trees reaching toward the light, might be the only legacy that truly mattered. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us create more in-depth documentaries, exploring the hidden stories of power, ambition, and the human cost of difficult choices. We'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. Drop a comment below, telling us your country or city. Hearing from our global audience reminds us that these stories of conscience and consequence resonate across all borders and cultures. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next documentary.